Hello, welcome back to the Wonder of the Bible. I guess this is lesson 7 now. It is going along. We're going to study Joseph, or more accurately, we're going to study Jacob. This really is the this is really about Jacob and the second half of his life told through his family. As always, we ask the question, what does this story reveal about the nature of Yahweh's interaction with people? We will, as usual, be using the Lexham English Bible. You can find a link to it in the description below if you want to follow along in the Bible. I want to talk about today about a not dramatic God. We've spent several weeks looking at um, how God works in miraculous ways, amazing, dramatic ways to shepherd his will. What, though, about when Yahweh is less dramatic? Is he not trying very hard? Is he just working, or is he just working as powerfully, but more discreetly? We talked about creation and fall, and how God made this massive universe. How Adam and Eve were in the wonderful garden and threw it all away in their attempt to be like God. We talked about Noah and the flood that just transformed the earth. We talked about Babel and how God came and wiped out their languages, changed everything. We spent 3 weeks with Abraham and how God worked over and over in his life and actively talked and consulted with him. And it's just amazing, right? But today, let's talk about Joseph. But we often look at him in isolation to his father, but this is really, the commentators point this out, this is structured just like the other patriarchal stories. This is not just a story about Joseph. This is a story about a transition from the patriarchs to the tribes, but it's also a transition in Jacob's family. He started out as such a scoundrel in his life, and by the end, he becomes a completely different person. And his sons make a journey like that. Jacob, Joseph's history is more to do with the family's migration to Egypt than Joseph overcoming obstacles to become second to Pharaoh. Joseph's history is more to do with the saving of the promise than the victory over his brothers. He preserved the promised family, and he led them into Egypt, where they would become slaves, and that was important. We'll look at 4 characters at varying levels in the story. Jacob, a little, because it is his story. Joseph, the obvious one, but Judah, and of course, Yahweh. You know, Isaac was a bad dad. I'm not sure the Bible records very many nice things about Isaac. Jacob was worse. He saw the consequence of his father's favoritism and how it split him and Esau, and he doubles down on it. Just like in his own family, his favoritism tears apart his own family, his children. He knew of his grandfather's tendency to inaction, think Abraham and Sarah and the abductions and how he leaves it up to God to rescue her. He doubles down on it. When he returned to from Haran with his 4 wives, and Esau is coming to, he thinks, to get him, what does he do? This skunk doesn't walk up to his brother. He doesn't stand up with a set of with army or troops or anything. He sends his lesser wives first. You're the least favorite wife, you go first with your kids, and you're the next least favorite, you go next. And finally, in the end, it's him. Let all the wives die, but him protect himself. Levi and Simeon, they slaughter a town because the prince of the town harmed their sister Dinah. And he has mild word rebuke. Now everybody here is going to hate us. We're going to have to move somewhere else. Really? Judah, or Reuben, firstborn, violates his father. And he's just like, doesn't say anything. Judah. I mean, Joseph is hated by his brothers. What's Isaac do? Doesn't say a word, keeps it to himself. And despite all of this, despite being just about the worst dad ever, he's chosen. Remember, Yahweh selected him over his older brother Esau before they were born, picked him. And despite all of his terrible behavior, Yahweh shepherds and guides and protects his children. Yahweh will judge, does judge, but he's also a merciful God. He's so very patient. Despite the punishment that should be here, he is guiding patiently. Quick note on firstborn here. Reuben, born first, he's defiled himself. Never gonna happen. Levi and Simeon, they massacre a town. Judah, scoundrel, but he's currently operating as the firstborn, but only just on the edge. Okay? We're going to enter the story as the family shatters. Joseph is just coming of age, and these are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, when 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was the helper with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, the wives of his father, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father, their father. Now he's tattling on them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all of his sons, for he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe with long sleeves for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and were not able to speak peaceably with him. Firstborn with a favorite wife and a child of Isaac's old age, Joseph treated like royalty. This can cause some serious problems in any situation. There was once upon a time I was working and I had some older peers, and my boss decided it was time to retire, and he named me heir apparent. I didn't receive, that I perceived anyway, any special treatment, but simply by being heir apparent turned my peers against me. Several years later, the boss finally had not retired and kicked me to the curb, decided that my good friend would be his heir apparent instead. In that move, I lost forever one of my best friends. My peers who had so disliked me became cordial after that. Eventually, they explained how they perceived me. Everything I did was clouded with suspicion. They had imputed ill will even when there was none. None of it was true, of course. I, it didn't matter though. It was how they perceived me by virtue of being heir apparent. And I learned some interesting things that day, or through that pain. People really tend to dislike the person who is flagged as the favorite. Sometimes the favorite one flaunts it and they kind of bring it on themselves. But even when they don't, it is very common for favoritism to turn everyone else jealous and angry. And I'll tell you what, it's really hard to not respond that way, especially once you understand it. What's going on, and choosing to stand above it is not simple. And look at this. He loves him so much. He's got this great coat. He spends the time and money on this one son. And as much as Joseph loves them, the brothers hated him just as much. That word is to strongly dislike or have an aversion towards something, to get rid of it, to push it away. It's the idea of abhorring. I can't have it in my presence. Now, I want to observe something as we talk about this. Yahweh is not the author of sin, but he does turn the actions of sinners to his plan. And that's what we see here. Yahweh promised that the family would be slaves in another country. So they have to go, they have to become slaves. And he begins using Jacob's favoritism, just like the frog slowly boiling in a pot. First, there are the dreams. This is really the only kind of active way that we see Yahweh stick his finger into the story. He gives Joseph dreams. And Joseph, it's really the three sets of dreams. He says, and first one, Joseph tells everybody the story, rather foolishly at some level. And the brothers just can't take it. They hate him so much for these dreams. And then the second dream comes along, and now Jacob's angry because you want me to bow down to you, child. You get a little, big head there. Um, but Yahweh is bringing the situation to a boil. Somewhere along, the brothers are married. It's not a big tribe anymore. Jacob had come back gone just himself, and he comes back. And so at the end of the story, there's only 70 people, all family at that point. The brothers are married, but they're all going to be living in close community, and they go out in the fields, they're working together, taking care of the animals and whatever crops they've planted. And the conversation is regularly hatred of Joseph. Um, and Jacob knew how much his brothers or how much the brothers hated Joseph. And he doesn't say anything. He knew how wicked they were and how violent they were. And they were. And yet, he must have assumed they're not going to touch Joseph. How wrong he was. Jacob is failing to intervene. He's failing to deal with things. And through all of this, he is fracturing his family. Again, Yahweh is shepherding things forward. He is working, albeit discreetly. And you know the story, right? Joseph goes to Shechem to find his brothers because he's being sent for his father. And of course, they're gone. And there's a man there who's like, oh, they went over to Dothan. So he sets off for a new region far away. And they see him coming. Moses doesn't record which brother first brought up the idea. And of course, they weren't all there at that time because they're out taking care of the animals and whatever. But they make the decision, we're going to murder him. In a far off land, nobody knows, we just bury the body. Life can only get better. And they saw him from a distance. They conspired to kill him. Look, it's the master of dreams. This master of dreams is coming. Now then, come, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we'll lie about it, say an animal devoured him, and then we'll see what happens with his dreams. Notice how his dreams play such an important role. He was favorite, but he seems to be the favorite of Yahweh. And they look at that and they're like, whatever. We'll kill him, we'll end this, and then we'll see what happens. Reuben hears of it. He delivers him from their hand, and said, we must not take his life. And Reuben said to them, you must not shed his blood. Throw him into this pit that is in the desert, but do not lay a hand on him. So he might rescue him, bring him back to his father. Reuben, 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 always the fool. Lioness got cisterns for catching water. They dump him into the cistern, he'd die of natural causes. He was they wouldn't have actively murdered their own family then, right? Of course, this rich from a family who murdered a village, whole town. Firstborn, terrible dude, Reuben is just not too bright. He had crossed lines that were unconscionable. He is not on good terms with his father. Best we understand this, he's looking at this as an opportunity to uh, garner favor with his dad, get back into his dad's good graces, maybe even become firstborn again. Regardless of his reason for doing this, though I do think it is because he wants to earn firstborn again, he successfully stops the murder. Remember, Yahweh is moving the family to Egypt. He's going to enslave them in Egypt. But to do that, he needs to orchestrate several things. Joseph needs to go ahead and prepare a place for them, and a famine needs to drive them out of the land into Canaan, out of the land to Canaan. This cannot happen if Joseph is dead or stays in Canaan. Therefore, Yahweh is using the actions of the brothers. He's led them far away from home where they could contemplate a murder, but he is preventing it and using their actions to preserve the life of Joseph. Yahweh is working even through these brothers who are so wicked. Happened that Joseph comes along, they strip Joseph his robe, they throw him into the pit, and they sit down and they eat dinner right there, leaving him in the pit. As they lift up their eyes, they look, behold, a caravan of Ishmaelites was coming from Gilead, and their camels were carrying aromatic gum and balm and spices on the way to Egypt. Okay. And Judah says to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites. But our hands shall not be against him, for he is our brother in our own flesh. His brothers agreed. Then Midianite traders passed by, and they drew up Joseph, brought him up from the pit, and they sell him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they brought Joseph to Egypt. And Reuben returns to the pit, sees Joseph's not there, tears his clothes, says, the boy is gone, now what can I do? Ishmaelites, Midianites, Ishmaelites would be their uncle. Ishmael's are uncle. Midianites are uncles. Was an uncle. Midian was an uncle. All descendants of Abraham. So these are cousins. Judah, desperate to live up to his brother's shining example, decides not to commit murder, but how about we enter into human trafficking instead? Then we can each get a few bucks. It's more profitable. Unbelievable. Poor Reuben, though, right? How's he going to earn forgiveness now? He comes back from taking his turn in the field with the animals, and it's like, what happened to the boy? How am I now going to earn forgiveness? You see what's happening, though? The sin of Jacob, his favoritism, his lethargy to deal with him, his failure to teach his sons right, all of these have brought about a crisis. The sin of the brothers to kill, better yet, enslave their brother to their cousin is horrible. And yet, all of this is furthering the will of God. Not that he is the cause of sin, because he is not. But their actions, despite all of their efforts to do wrong, they're still feeding his plan. Yahweh is working. Joseph, the favorite, the good brother, is shackled and led to Egypt. They dipped the shredded coat in the blood of a goat to deceive their father. This is ironic, of course. Remember why? Jacob, what he used to deceive his father Isaac, but the meat of a goat and the hair of the goat on his arms to pretend to be Esau. Just as he used the goat to deceive his father, his sons used the goat to deceive him. In passing, chapter 38 of Genesis tells how Judah begins to change. He has terrible boys. Yahweh himself decides to come and execute those boys. Um, it would be Judah's daughter-in-law that would prod him to begin changing. He's quick to judge her, but then he acknowledges that she is the righteous one and he is the wicked one. That moment of acknowledging his sin and her righteousness over him is a transition point in many ways for him. There's not a lot said about Judah, but the actions against Joseph, their father's grief, the shared guilt of the brothers, and Tamar's action all begin the process of Yahweh working to transform Judah's life. Meanwhile, in Egypt, Joseph is a slave to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh. For 13 years, Joseph will be a slave in Egypt before he stands before Pharaoh, and it will be another 7 years before he sees his siblings again. He's gonna, long time. But, I'm going to talk a little bit about Joseph's walk with Yahweh. Nowhere does the Bible spend time discussing Joseph's walk with God. Given the horrific status of his family, one could be forgiven in thinking they were pagans. Certainly, they don't show a whole lot of remorse through most of the story, or any care about righteousness. Yet Joseph quietly serves Yahweh, and the pagans notice it. Yahweh was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master observed that Yahweh was with him, and everything that was in his hand to do, Yahweh made successful. Potiphar observes that that Yahweh was with Joseph and blessing Joseph. This brought promotions, and Joseph became the steward of the household. There would be servants in the field and servants in the house, and Joseph ran it all. While all this is going on, Judah's back home being taught lessons by Tamar. Jacob is still grieving the loss of Joseph. But Joseph is just obeying. He doesn't try to escape. He doesn't attempt to get revenge. He just accepts his lot as appointed by Yahweh and embraces that position. This isn't necessarily overnight, right? I mean, he is human. He is going to take time to grow. Slowly, he's at least 5 years in Potiphar's house. It would be reasonable, maybe at least 5 years, probably closer to 7 or 8. Slowly, patiently being moved up the line and into a position of managing the whole house. And you know what? All this time, Yahweh is working. Not only is Joseph building that deep relationship with God, he is learning the skills of management. He's a slave in a foreign land with no rights or privileges, and yet here he is learning what he needs to run a country. Kind of cool. There are many reasons for Joseph to reject Potiphar's wife. There's the risk of being caught was so high. He certainly could have been executed. Maybe he respected Potiphar. Oh, yeah, I like it. There's all these reasons it could be there, right? But look at what he says. But he refused her and says to the master's wife, look, my master does not worry about what is in the house. Everything he owns he has put in my hand. He has no greater authority in this house than me. He has not withheld anything from me except you, since you are his wife. Now how can I do this great wickedness and sin against him? Right? But that's not what he says, right? That's what you expect him to say. You expect him to say, how can I sin against Potiphar? And instead he says, how can I sin against God? This statement should give you whiplash because it doesn't make sense in the context of the story. He talks about his submission to Potiphar. He acknowledges the limits of his authority. And you would expect him to say that, and he says the sin is against God. If he had committed the sin, it would be a sin against Potiphar. It would be a sin against Potiphar's wife. But Joseph understood that more importantly, it was ultimately a sin against Yahweh. I don't think Genesis ever explains this principle before this. Have you? It's not that he had access to Genesis anyway, right? Like it's being written later about him. He's part of it. So how did he know this sin was primarily against God and not the people around him? Where was this revelation? Did Jacob teach him this? Seems unlikely. I believe it can only come from pondering the acts of Yahweh himself. Have you ever wondered why the Psalms were so rich in theology? It's not because David was receiving these bursts of inspiration while he's sitting out in the field with the sheep writing Psalms. It's because Psalm 119 tells us it's because he studied the law. He went back to the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. He went back to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and he studied it, and he meditated it, and he thought on it, and he drew out from it understanding about God. Somewhere, Moses would collect all of this information about God, all of this information, these stories and writings from creation forward that he would use to write out the Pentateuch. Somewhere in this, Joseph had access to information about Yahweh. Some of it family history, some of it elsewhere. And he studied it. He had to have studied it. He had to have thought of it. And he began to recognize that sin was first and foremost against God. As he sat there, a slave, trapped in a foreign land, this is what he was learning. Scripture doesn't explicitly state this. What Scripture does do is teach us these ideas, and it teaches us to study Yahweh and to learn. There is a reason Abraham felt safe, stating that Yahweh wouldn't destroy the righteous. Abraham knew God. David knew God. Job knew God. Joseph knew God. And Joseph's knowledge of God revealed to him that all things work together for good. And this raises the obvious question. How well do you know God? The experience with Potiphar's wife was a test of Joseph's character. He Would he fold like David and Solomon or Judah to the treachery of an easily attainable woman? Would he abuse his position of authority? Would he act equal to his master like Hagar did? No, Joseph was demonstrated true leadership. Wine, women, song would not sway him from following Yahweh. Only obedience to Yahweh matters, like Abraham at the end of his life. He was incorruptible. Kind of a politician you wish you could vote for, right? Yahweh is protecting his life again. For all the great position Joseph had in the house of Pharaoh, or Potiphar, Potiphar could have executed him. You know, the scheming of this vicious woman had him dropped into prison. Maybe Potiphar believed her. Maybe he didn't, but had to make a show of it. Maybe he decided not to kill Joseph because of the good things Joseph had done. Because he knew that Yahweh had been blessing Joseph. Whatever he thought his reason was for not punishing Joseph, not killing Joseph, let me let you know a secret. It's because Yahweh was preserving his life. Whatever his decision-making process was, Yahweh was working through it. Prison, same song, second verse, a little bit faster, a little bit worse as the song goes. More time at the bottom, working his way up the ladder. This time, it's the keeper of the jail who recognized that Joseph had the blessing of Yahweh upon him. Moses is clear these pagans saw and they understood that Joseph was special and that deity was with him. They trusted Joseph and they relied on him. I don't know what they saw in him. He wasn't just a nice, competent guy. There was something about him that said, God has his finger on him. God is with him and blessing him. He served as a slave and managed a household of slaves. He's a prisoner and now he's managing prisoners. Yahweh is working. Here's a question. How was he going to meet Pharaoh if he hadn't first met the cupbearer in prison? Everything it keeps all of these actions for all of these people, the cupbearer and the baker and their whatever it was they did to get in trouble. Pharaoh not killing them right away, but sending them to prison to be under Joseph. All of these things are happening, and it's not God stepping in and talking to people. He's not actively doing miracles everywhere. But he is working, albeit discreetly. The family shattered, the descent into prison. Now we have the rise into power. Joseph, of course, doesn't stay in prison, right? He finds himself with two political prisoners, and we know the story, right? They have their dream. They have their dreams. And when Joseph came to them in the morning, he looked at them, and behold, they were troubled. And he asked the court officials of Pharaoh that were with him in the custody of his master's house, "Why are your faces sad today?" I'm sorry, this just might be the most absurd and funny statement in all of Genesis. These two are in prison. Pharaoh's angry with him. He's about to kill one of them. And Joseph says, "Why are you sad? What is this, like a hotel? Are they on the Riviera?" It's like a butler coming out to the pool to offer the bazillionaire a fresh lemonade. And I say, why are you upset? Is the sun too hot? Is the pool too cold? Would you like some more shade? I mean, what kind of prison is he running? I mean, come on. It's a prison. They're in trouble. But apparently, this question was credibly asked and answered. They weren't offended by him and they accepted his question. What does this say about Joseph? What kind of kindness and gentleness must he have had? What meekness? Remember, he had an iron spine. On the other hand, he's so gentle and kind. These men, there's this assumption that they would not be upset in his care. And he says, what's wrong? And so they tell him. They don't get snotty. They're not like, hey, we're in prison. It's like, yeah, well, we had these bad dreams and they're unusual. And, and he's like, well, you know, you're going back and you're going to die. Sorry. And what does it say about him that they looked at that and were like, okay, he's telling the truth. He's right. There is something in his walk with God. This is a life transformed by the study of Yahweh. He knew God and it was clear. All these long years toiling away as an alien in the land, he's not meditating on revenge or escape, but focused on serving, contented with where he's been planted. He is focused on Yahweh and learned that others matter more, and they see it. I could do with more of this learning. Tell you what, 2 long years later, Joseph has been hoping the cupbearer would keep his promise to talk to Pharaoh about him, help him get out of this prison. Nothing. Nada. Joseph is once again learning patience. Patience and hope while being contented with this situation. Then Pharaoh is awakened. He's angry with the court. He's had bad dreams, and not just like uncomfortable or nightmares, but omens. No one, not any of his court magicians, his gods, nobody could help him. Suddenly, the cupbearer's memories jogged. Hey, when I was in prison because you were angry with me, there's this man who can interpret dreams. So they clean up, bring him out. And again, this is Yahweh working. If the cupbearer had remembered earlier, Joseph may have come and gone and been out of the country, set free. But instead, Joseph walks in and Pharaoh says, I have these really bizarre dreams. And Joseph, hey, God's given this dream, but it's like this movie, right? They're like just this absurdism story in Pharaoh's head. And he knew it was something more, but there's not this level of activity like with Abimelech or so forth and the other points where God is actively, you know, doing these things and talking to people. Um, and we don't see Joseph like going off into a trance or it's like, well, I'm going to go sleep or I'm going to go pray for a while. We see him simply respond with an interpretation. No funny voice, no waving his hands in the air, no weird babble or drooling or mystical signs. He's just acknowledged the power to interpret dreams is not mine, he says. It is Yahweh. And let me tell you what Yahweh is telling you. Yahweh says this is going to be a famine. 7 good years, 7 bad years. And I'm just going to say you really need to have somebody collect a bunch of food in the good years and have it ready for everybody in the bad years. You should probably find somebody to do that. And just a simple, here's the dreams, here's the answer, and oh, here's some advice. The whole thing is bizarre. This foreign prisoner walks in from jail, just walks in and calmly tells them the thing and be like, it's not me, it's God. And by the way, it is God. And here's what he says. And you probably want to go do these things. Everybody in the court, like their jaws hanging on the floor. Just like, who is this dude? What in the world? Most normal people are going to be like, hey, I got this really cool plan and you really want to hire me and I can show you all the ways to solve this problem. And by the way, just get me out of prison and whatever. None of it. Nothing. For all Joseph knows, he's going to end up right back in prison the next day. And he is content with what God has. And Pharaoh sees it. The court sees it. Joseph was walking with God and not pursuing his own self-interest. And Pharaoh says, I want it. This man is not a threat to power. He is not looking out for himself. I want him to run my country. And so Joseph rises to power. For 7 years, he taxes the nation and prepares for the coming climate disaster. Now, the end, the reunification of the family. Joseph has been gone for 20 years. 20 years the brothers have watched their father mourn. Judah has lost 2 sons to God's judgment. He's been rebuked by his daughter-in-law. But you know what? Yahweh is on the move. With the famine rolling across the land, Jacob sends his son to Egypt for supplies. The first dream has come true. The brothers are bowing to Joseph. Such lovely irony. Has the family changed that much, though? Let's find out. Remember, Joseph is always talking through an interpreter to his brothers. He incarcerates them all as spies, and only one will get to go home and get Benjamin and prove their story. After 3 days, he comes in and he says, you all get to go except one. I'm going to permit one of you to stay. By permit, he ties up Simeon and tosses him back in prison. And you know what? The brothers are united, not in greed or revenge, but as brothers. Partially in guilt, the story of guilt. We don't have time to dig into it, all the verses, but the guilt of their response to their treatment of Joseph keeps coming back. But partially, these men are becoming a family again. Jacob, he's unhappy with the turn of events. Joseph is gone. Simeon is gone. Benjamin's at risk. He's going to either send Benjamin into danger or the family dies, right? And look at Reuben. Reuben says to his father, you may kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back to you. Put him in my hand, and I myself will return him to you. But Jacob said, my son will not go down with you, for his brother is dead and he alone remains. If harm meets him on the journey that you would take, you would bring down my gray head in sorrow to the grave, to Sheol. Reuben, never learning. Never learning. You didn't get it. Jacob doesn't want to kill his grandsons. He wants Benjamin to stay alive and the grandsons to stay alive. This is like, what is wrong with you? Reuben, you're offering to sacrifice your sons for yourself and for our food. Like, come on. Judah, though, a few weeks later, says to his father, send the boy with me and let us arise and go so that we will live and not die. You, we, and our children. I myself will be surety for him. You may seek him from my hand. If I do not bring him back to you and present him before you, then I will stand guilty before you forever. Surely if we had not hesitated by this time, we would have returned twice. He uses reason, logic with his father, says it's not just about us. He's not offering up his kids. He says, I stand as the surety for you. I will be responsible. But if you don't do this, everyone here dies. Save the family by taking this risk. You see him stepping up, and they go back. Everyone goes back, and Judah is now the undisputed leader of the family. They're ushered into Joseph's house. They're reunited with Simeon, but they're worried that they're going to be accused of thievery because remember they found their gold that they had taken back in their sacks. They go to give it back, pay double, and Joseph's like, "No, we have all the money." The guilt is just palpable. And again, they think that all of this punishment and this stuff is coming as punishment for their actions against Joseph. They live under such guilt. Now, when they leave, Joseph decides one more test. He frames Benjamin. Remember, his servant goes and they say, whoever has stolen this cup will be the slave. Well, of course, it's in Benjamin's sack. And the brothers are like, oh no, not Benjamin. So they all pack up and go back. I mean, think about this a minute. In the past, would they have protected Joseph? No, they sold him into slavery. They were going to kill him. And here they are protecting the favored child. Something has changed in their lives. They are not about to abandon him. Judah leads the way. And Judah says, what can we say to my Lord after the accusation? How do we prove our innocence? God has found out our guilt. We didn't do this, but we are guilty nonetheless. Behold, we are slaves to my Lord, both we and also he in whose hand the cup was found. Joseph doesn't want, he offers themselves up, and Joseph doesn't want him. It's like, I don't want you all, just Benjamin. I'll keep him. One last chance for the brothers to escape and abandon the favorite child. Oh, Dad, sorry, nothing we could do about it. But Judah's response is telling. He doesn't ask for himself or his brothers, but he asks for Joseph's mercy on their father. He explains the situation and says, please let your servant remain in place of the boy as a slave to my Lord. Let the boy go up with his brothers. For how can I go up to my father if the boy is not with me? I do not want to see the misery which will find my father. Judah will do anything to prevent more misery upon his father, more acquiring more guilt. What a transformed life. Jacob, he comes to Egypt. There, Joseph reveals himself. Jacob comes down. Uh, and Jacob is going to make pronouncements about his children. And there, this is where Reuben, Levi, and Simeon are again called out for their wickedness and their actions. But Judah is formally defined as the firstborn, who would father the kings of Israel. From him would be the serpent slayer. Judah transformed from a slaver and a terrible father to the father of the Messiah. From a destroyer, from a slaver to firstborn, from a destroyer to a builder. Joseph is a pretty amazing guy. It's true. But I think the story of Judah might be more amazing. Joseph is rejected by his family and becomes the savior of them all. Rejected by his brothers, he rescues them. From a stumbling block to the cornerstone. Just like the Messiah. He is a picture for us. Yahweh works loudly at times, dramatically, overwhelming floods. brimstone from heaven, talking to people in their dreams. But sometimes Yahweh works quietly, permitting sinful actions to advance his plan. If Joseph hadn't been hated, he wouldn't have been sold. If Potiphar's wife hadn't slandered him, he wouldn't have met the cupbearer. If he hadn't met the cupbearer, he wouldn't have saved his family. All the while, Yahweh was moving. And look at Judah, greedy, self-centered, wicked sons, terrible actions. He becomes the one who would set himself as a bulwark to protect his father and his brother. Nothing short of Yahweh's intervention in his life. How is Yahweh working in your life? How is he using the circumstances, even the sin of yourself and those around you, to put you where he wants you, to guide you down the path of his choosing?